Welcome everyone, and in this video we are going to create a time picker from scratch using SolidJS and TailwindCSS. This is what we are going to be building today, and as you can see, this is a simple select time picker, and once the user presses the input, the dropdown opens with the hours, minutes and seconds for the user to select. There are multiple ways for the user to input their values. The user can either click on the value with the mouse, and not only it gets selected, but you can see that there's a scroll animation bringing the value to the top of the dropdown. So let's go ahead and select now the seconds. And once the user is satisfied, it can click on the select button. Okay, perfect. And now if you open the console, you can see that we get the value not only in seconds, but also as an object with the hours, minutes and seconds. Another way for the user to input their values is again by clicking on the input select time. And as you can see, the hours input gets focused first. This enables the user to start typing on the keyboard, so for example 12, and then if we select tab, we can input the minutes already, so go ahead and type something, again tab for the seconds now, type something else, and lastly tab one more time to select the button and then just press enter. And again, like last time, we get the values in seconds and again in an object with the hours, minutes and seconds. Not only that, but you can edit the values by clicking on the input of your choice. So in this case, the minutes, and then just type backspace to delete the values and then type your new value, like so. If you don't click on the select button and simply click outside of the time picker, you can see that the value defaults to the previous saved value. I hope you guys enjoy building this with me, so let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we are going to need is to install SolidJS, and for that we are going to type the following command. So npx digit SolidJS templates, but now instead of being a JavaScript, we are going to use a TypeScript. So type in ts and then just dot to save it on this project. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we already have the folders here for SolidJS. Next, we need to install TailwindCSS. So let's go ahead and type yarn add, and we are going to install it on the development side. So -d TailwindCSS, and we are also going to need the post CSS. And finally, auto prefixer. Okay, perfect. Now we need the configuration files for Tailwind. And to do that, we are going to type npx tailwind css init -b. Now inside the tailwind.config, we are going to reference all of our files like so. Now on our source folder, inside the index.css on the top, we are going to import all of the Tailwind directives, like so. Okay, perfect. Now let's just go ahead and in our app.tsx, let's delete everything and simply leave it a hello world header already with the Tailwind classes. Go ahead and also delete this. We also don't need the app.module.css, so go ahead and delete it. And now on the console, simply type yarn start, like so. Okay, perfect. And as you can see, we now have the hello world header already with the Tailwind classes. The only thing we're missing is to be able to do a dynamic classing with Tailwind. And to make sure that everything goes okay, we are going to install the yarn, so yarn add, Tailwind merge. This package will simply allow us to do a dynamic classing with Tailwind without the fear of overlapping some classes. Okay, perfect, and that's it. So let's start building our component. Okay, perfect. So let's start building our component by creating, first of all, inside the source folder, a new folder, and let's call it Timepicker, like so. And inside, we are going to create the main index.tsx file. Inside, we are going to create a component, so export function, call it Timepicker, like so. And for now, simply return a div saying time picker. Now we can already create the interface for this component, so go ahead and export interface time picker props. And this component will simply receive two things. So first of all, it's the time itself, so the current time that's saved, and this will be saved on a signal, a SolidJS signal. So you can go ahead and create this as an accessor, so import it from SolidJS, of type number, meaning that this will be a signal with the number type saved inside. Now, every signal not only has an accessor, but also has a setter. So we are going to also add a set time setter. So go ahead and import it from SolidJS. And this will be the only two things that our component will need. Don't forget to set the props to the same type of the Timepicker props, like so. Now, back in our app.tsx, we can go ahead and already change this to import our newly created component. So first of all, let's create already the signal. So it's going to be, again, a create signal from SolidJS of type number, and just set it to 0. Don't forget that this is going to be in seconds. So this time is going to always reference the number of seconds saved on the signal. Now for the app itself, go ahead and delete this and simply give it a little wrapper. So this is nothing much. It's just the width. It's going to be the size of the screen, also with the height. It's going to have a grayish background, and we are going to center everything. And this is simply going to be the wrapper for the component itself. And we simply do this to have a max width of extra small in this case, so that we don't have a large input. Now go ahead and import your component like so, and pass in the time and the set time signal. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we already have our component over here. Now, before we continue building our time picker, we are going to need a new type. So for that, we are going to create a new file inside the Timepicker folder, and let's call it types.ts. And this is just going to be a simple interface. Let's call it time values, and it will simply have the hours, minutes, seconds in a number format, like so. Okay, perfect. So now let's start with the div. So go ahead and delete the Timepicker. And this will have basically two components that we are going to create. So first of all, it's going to be the Timepicker Input. So the actual input we see at the beginning on which the user can click. And then a Timepicker Dropdown. Again, this is going to be the dropdown with all of the values that the user can select. So the main component, it's going to essentially have only two signals. So the first one, is open signal, which is going to be a Boolean. And this is only to know if the dropdown is open or not. And finally, the actual time values that we get from the time accessor. But instead of being in seconds, we want it to be in the object of time values that we created earlier. So go ahead and create a new signal of type time values, like so. And we are going to convert this seconds to the time values. And in order to do that, we are going to create a new file, and let's call it utils.ts. And inside, we are going to create a new function and call it seconds to time values, which just receives the seconds in number and outputs the time values. To calculate the hours, we simply need to divide these seconds by the number of seconds that 1 hour contains. To calculate the minutes, it's simply going to be the modulus of the number of seconds that an hour contains divided by the number of minutes that an hour contains. And finally, the remaining seconds, it's simply going to be the modulus of the number of seconds inside a minute. And since we are here, we can also do the opposite. So create a new function and call it time values to seconds, which does the opposite. So it's simply going to multiply the number of hours by, again, the number of seconds that an hour contains, the number of minutes with the number of minutes that an hour contains, plus the number of seconds. So now, again, in our index.tsx, we can already import this from the utils, and now we will have the time values saved, converted from the time accessor. Okay, perfect. So now we can already pass in the signals to the Timepicker input and dropdown we are going to create. So the input, it's going to need all of the signals. So go ahead and just insert them. And the dropdown, it's going to need not all of them. It's going to need to know if the dropdown is open, so it can do the animation of opening and closing, but it's not going to set it. That responsibility is going to be on this index.tsx. And again, just pass in the time values and the setter for the time values, so every time the user clicks on something, then the signal gets updated. Finally, it's going to have a onConfirm event handler, which simply gets triggered every time the user clicks on the select button of the dropdown. And what this basically is going to do is call in the set time we get from the props with the time values 2 seconds, because again, don't forget that this signal on the set time and time, it's going to be of type number. So it's going to be the seconds. So here we are just simply converting the time values to the seconds and passing into the signal we get from the parent. And not only that, but we want to close the dropdown every time the user clicks on the select. So go ahead and set is open to false, like so. Okay, perfect. So now before we continue creating the input in the dropdown, one thing to finalize this component is to close it every time the user clicks outside of the component itself. And in order to do that, first of all, we are going to create a onMount and onCleanup effect and simply add and remove the event listener with the following function. So this basically means that every time the component is mounted, it's going to add a new event listener of type click with the following function. And every time the component gets cleaned up, so unmounted, then it's going to simply remove the event listener. Now, before we can actually do the handle click outside logic, we are going to need a reference for the component itself. So at the top, create a new variable and just call it wrapper ref. And it's going to be of type HTML div element. Now to actually reference it here on the div, we are going to pass in our new variable. We can already put in the classes and it's going to be really simple. First of all, it's going to be relative because the dropdown is going to be an absolute and we want it to be relative to the parent component. And finally, it's going to be of full width so we can get the input to stretch as needed by the user. Okay, now that we have our reference, the only thing we need to do is check if, first of all, the reference exists, because there might be the possibility of not existing, and if the event.target, so the element that the user clicked, is not inside of that reference. So if the reference does not contain that element, then we can simply say that the user clicked outside of the element. And the only thing we do is close, first of all, so set the open to false, and we are going to reset the time values. So we're going to update the time values signal with the seconds to time values conversion of the time that we get from the prop. So we don't save a new value, we reset to what we received from the parent. And that's it. So we have now our main building block for our component, and next video we are going to take care of the input. Okay, so now for the input, let's go ahead and create a new file and call it Timepicker Input.tsx. And like always, go ahead and create the function, and we can already create the interface of the props, which, as we know it, it's going to be 4 values. So the accessor and the setter of the 2 signals of the open and the time values. Go ahead and import the time values also, like so. And then inside the function, simply return a div. Back in our index.tsx, we can already import this, so go ahead and do that. And just so we can see something on the screen, let's go ahead and just comment this out. So, perfect. And again, in our input, let's go ahead and do Timepicker Input, like so. Okay, so now we can see the changes over here. And let's start styling first the component. So let's go ahead and create a class, and we are going to do a dynamic class. So go ahead and surround this with the object, which is going to be the Tailwind merge from the Tailwind merge, like so. Okay, so the first class, the main class, first of all, we can say it's going to be a cursor pointer. So the user knows it's clickable. It's going to have a white text, well, not completely white, with a little bit of opacity, like so. The font is going to be extra small, the text size, and the font, it's going to be semi-bold. We are going to give it a grayish background of around 900, like so. We are going to change the background color on hover, and it's going to be the same color, but with a 70 of opacity. So it's gray 950, like so. The input, it's going to have a border, and that border, it's going to be white, but very low opacity of 10. it's going to have a extra small shadow. It's going to be rounded on medium size. The width it's going to be full, and we are going to set a fixed height of 9. Now let's center everything with flex items center, like so. And now simply give it a padding on the x-axis of 3. Okay, perfect. And finally, let's just add a transition all, because we are going to put in some effects. Okay, perfect. So now we have our input. As you can see, it changes the background once the user hovers it. Now the only thing we're missing is to add a conditional class. You can do it on the bottom inside the Tailwind merge function. And we are going to say that if the props is open, then we want to add a outline none, ring of 1 size, and the color of the ring, it's going to be white with a 40 opacity. And we can already try and see this change by doing a on-click event on the input. So every time the user clicks on the input, the only thing we want to do is to call in the props.set is open to true to again open the dropdown. So it's currently closed. If we click on the input, it gets open and we can see that we have the ring effect around the input. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and delete this over here, and this is going to be, first of all, a paragraph saying select time, like so. But we don't want to display this if we have some kind of values. So what we can do is on top of the return, like so, we can create a new signal and call it is not empty, which is going to be an arrow function, like so. And then we can say that it's not empty if, first of all, is open. So if it is open, we don't want to render the select time, or if we have some kind of time values on the hours greater than 0. The same can apply to the minutes, so minutes, and also for the seconds. So if we have some kind of value stored on the time values, then we don't want to render the select time paragraph, and we want to rather render the time values itself. So to do that, let's go ahead and give it a class on the paragraph. Again, it's going to be conditional, so Tailwind merge. And the main class, it's not going to have anything. The only thing we are going to do is say if is not empty, right? So if it is open or we have some kind of time values, then we want this paragraph to be hidden, like so. So as you can see, it's currently open, so we don't get the select time rendered. If we refresh the page, then it will be closed. If we click again, then we can see that the select time disappears. Now, if we don't have the select time paragraph, then what we want to render is the actual inputs for the values. So let's go ahead and create a wrapper for that. So a div, and it's going to be the first input for the hours, the second one for the minutes, and a last one for the seconds. Now we want to separate each of the inputs visually, so we can go ahead and in between each input, just simply put in a paragraph with the separator of your choice. Again, on the second one, like so. Now let's go ahead and first of all, give it the class for the wrapper, and it's going to be conditional again, because if it is rendering the select time, then we don't want to show these inputs. So let's start with the main classes, and this is going to be a flex and centering items. We are going to fit the width to the inputs and simply give it a gap of 1 between each input. Now, this is just for aesthetic reasons only, but we are going to actually move everything a little bit to the left, like so. So then when we get the padding inside the input, it stays on the same position that it would be if we didn't have this. Finally, what we want to say is if is not empty. So if it is empty, so this is a double negation, right? Then we want this to be hidden, like so. Now all of the inputs are going to have the same class, so we can go ahead and on the top create a new constant and call it input class, like so. Now simply pass in on each of the input classes. There you go. And first of all, let's just double check that the text, it's going to be white and it's going to be extra small. Now let's get rid of the background. So background transparent. We're going to remove the outline. So if it is selected, we don't get any kind of outline. Let's set a fixed height of 7 and of width of 8. Now we want these inputs to be clickable. So let's go ahead and tell the user that by passing in the cursor pointer, and on hover, let's just change the background to a white with a very low opacity. Finally, don't forget to make everything rounded on medium size. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, if we hover now on the inputs, we get the faded background effect. Okay, so now for the values, we can already pass in. So value props.time values, and for this one, it's going to be the hours. Sorry, time values, like so. This one, it's going to be the minute. And this one's going to be the seconds. Okay, so one thing I forgot about the input class is that we are also going to center the text, like so. Okay, perfect. So now we have the values, but as you can see, currently it has the 0, but we don't want it to be simply 0. We want it to be 0, 0. And every time we change the value, we want to always have 2 digits. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and create a new function for that. So inside the utils, go ahead and export function, and we are going to call it pad number to string. So what this does is, first of all, it's going to receive a number, like so, and it's going to output a string. And because we want to have always the 2 digits, we are going to, first of all, return a new string from the number. So we are going to make a number conversion to string. And then we are going to say pad start 2 digits with the 0 field default, like so. So now in our input, if we surround this value with our newly created function, like so, let's do the same for the others. We can see that we now have 2 digits every time the value changes. And if the value is below 10, meaning that it contains only 1 digit, then this will default with a 0 on the left of that digit. Okay, now what we want to do is actually change the value. So go ahead and on input, we are going to create a new handler. So handle on input hours. Do the same for the minutes and the seconds. And at the top, let's go ahead and create this 3 handlers. So the first one, handle on input hours, and just change the value names. So don't forget that each handler, it's going to receive the input event from it. And we can already receive the value we get from each input by creating a new value, which we'll get from the target.value. So do the same for each of them. And now what we know is that this value, it's going to be of type string, but we are dealing with numbers. So how can we do that? Let's go ahead and on the utils, create a new function, and it's going to be called checkIsNumber. So we will receive a number, but it's going to be of type string. And the only thing we are going to do is parse float, the actual value, and this will give us either a number or not. And we can simply say that if it's not nan, so if it is not an undefined number, we can say for sure that, okay, this is in fact a number, so return true. Otherwise, just return false. Okay, so now in our input, what we are going to say is if this value is a number, then we are going to do something with it. Otherwise, we don't do anything. We can now get the number value by doing a parse in from the value, because again, we know that it is a number, but we are only dealing with integers, not floats. Now, to change the values, we first need to check if this number is within 0 and 23, because again, that's the only possible hours that we have in a day. So if the input is between this range, then we want to change the values. So let's go ahead and props.setTimeValues, and we are going to get the old values, like so, from here, and then simply return a new object, first of all, with all of the previous old values, but with a newly updated hours. So hours, it's going to be the number value, like so. Okay, now let's do the same for the minutes. So simply copy and paste what we have on the hours. And instead of being from 0 to 23, it's going to be from 0 to 69. And again, don't forget here to update the minutes and not the hours. Finally, let's do the same for the seconds. And the seconds, it's going to be the same range as it is on the minutes, but let's update here for the seconds, like so. Okay, perfect. So now if we click and select one of the inputs, if we type in something like 12, for example, we can see that it changes the value. But if we try to do something like, for example, 34, which doesn't exist, we can see that it's still going to change the value of the input. This is because we are changing the time value signal. And if you would console log the value inside, you would see that it didn't have the 34, but we are not limiting on what can be written inside the input. So in order to fix this, let's go ahead and create 3 new references, each for each of the inputs we have, like so. And now simply say that if the actual number is within the range we want, then we want to update the signal. But if it is not, then what we want to do is change the value of the reference, in this case, the hours, again, to the same values as we did previously, on which we get from the parent component. So let's do the same for the minutes, like so, and for the seconds. There you go. Don't forget to actually get the reference. So on the input, pass in the input hours ref. The second one, it's going to be the minutes. The third input, the seconds. Okay, so now if we try again, let's say 12. Okay, we can see that it works. But if we try something outside the range, like for example 34, you can see that it gets stuck on the 3 because 34 it's outside of the range and this will not be possible. So perfect. Now, one last thing I want to do on the input is every time the user opens, I want it to be focused on the hours input so the user can already start typing. So at the top, we are going to create an effect. And we are simply going to say that if there is an input hours reference, and if the current input is open, then let's just focus on that reference. So now if we click on the inputs, we can see that the first input on the hours is already focused. Now we want to do the opposite. So every time the input closes, we want to blur every input that we have on our input component. So to do that, just go ahead and inside the create effect, do the same thing, but now it's if it is closed, then simply blur the input hours, the minutes, and the seconds, like so. Okay, nice. So the user can already click on the input and start typing whatever it wants. Like for example, 35 and 79. We can see that we tried 79 and it doesn't let us, which is work perfect. And the only thing missing now is the dropdown, so the user can select with the mouse and actually click on the select button to save the values on the signal. Okay, so now for the dropdown, let's go ahead and uncomment this on our index.tsx file. And let's create our dropdown component. So create a new file and call it Timepicker Dropdown.tsx. Let's go ahead and create the function like so, and create the interface with the props that we already discussed earlier. So import everything. Okay, perfect. So let's start with the styling. It's going to be a dynamic class. So again, Tailwind merge, like so. And the main class, let's go ahead and first say that we want the text to be white. It's going to be an absolute because again, we want it to be relative to the whole component. It's going to be flex on column orientation. It's going to have a medium shadow. And just so that we see what we are doing, let's again just put in the dropdown over here. Okay, perfect. Now let's say change the background to grayish, 950. Let's say that it's going to be rounded, large, and let's give it a margin on the top of 4. Now let's center everything inside X axis by doing margin X auto. like so. Let's fit the height and let's give it a fixed width of 64. Let's also center the items. Let's add a transition. Also, we have the opening and the closing effect with a little bit of animation. Let's give it a Z index of 50, so we know that is on top of everything. And now to actually center the wrapper in regards to the input, what we can do is, first of all, translate the x-axis to -1/2. So basically, we are going to translate on the x-axis by a half. And finally, just say that we want it to be positioned to the left again a half, like so. As you can see, now we have our dropdown centered in regards to our input. Okay, so now for the conditional classes, let's go ahead and if props is open, then we are going to type something. Otherwise, it's going to be another class. So let's go ahead and do this. And if it is in fact open, what we want to say is, first of all, we're going to say that the maximum height is going to be of 96, like so. It's going to have a border, a white border of, let's say, 10 opacity. Don't forget to add the border, sorry. We are going to translate the y-axis to 0 because we want to have the effect of coming up and down. We are going to give it a full opacity because, again, if it is closed, we want it to be invisible. And let's change the duration of the animation to 500 milliseconds, and scale the object to 100 because, again, we want to have an effect not only of coming up and down, but also from coming from behind to the front. And we can do this effect by changing the scale. Okay, perfect. So now if it is closed, let's go ahead and say that the maximum height, it's going to be 0. We are going to delete the border, so it's going to be transparent and border none. Let's translate to have an effect the y-axis, the y, like so, with a value of 6. Let's change the opacity to 0 and scale to about 75, like so. Also, just so we don't have any type of user click inside of this, we can actually make it all disappear by doing an overflow hidden, like so. Okay, so now if we click on the input, we can see that we get the animation of the drop down coming from the back and the top, like so. If we click outside, it's going to close and the animation is working, like so. Okay, perfect. Now, the first thing we need is the header. So let's go ahead and create a new div for that. And it's going to have the hours, minutes and seconds. So minutes and seconds, like so. Let's just open it to see. Okay, perfect. And because we want this to be on full width, we are going to make the wrapper a grid, and it's going to have 3 columns, like so. The text is going to be extra small, and the font is going to be bold. We are going to center the text, so text center, give it a border on the bottom, and it's going to be white with a 10 opacity, like so. And then simply have a padding on the y-axis of 3, so we can have a little bit of space. Also, don't forget to make this container full, like so. Perfect. Okay, so now for each of the hours, minutes, and seconds, we can do more or less the same. So let's go ahead and create a new wrapper. It's going to be a grid. It's going to be 3 columns and the font bold, text extra small. It's going to center all the text. Again, the width is going to be full. And we are going to set the overflow hidden so that we don't have the values coming outside the dropdown. So the first wrapper, it's going to be the one for the hours. So let's go ahead and create it. And it's going to have a dynamic class. So again, Tailwind merge. For now, we are not going to deal with the dynamic class. So we are just going to set the main class, which is going to be a flex col. So we get all of the numbers on a column orientation. We are going to center the items, give it a little bit of a gap. And to make the wrapper scrollable, what we are going to do is overflow y auto, like so. Then just give it a little bit of a padding. And we want the scroll to be smooth. So scroll smooth like so. So let's go ahead and see what we already have. Let's simply pass in a paragraph and say 1, and then just copy this like so, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, perfect. So the items are centered and they have a little bit of gap in between them. Perfect. Now, what we want to do is render all of the possible hours, and we know that it's going to range from 0 to 23. So we just need to create an array with all of those numbers and then do a for SolidJS loop with each of those values. So in order to make our job easier, what we are going to do is on the utils, we are going to create a new function and we are going to call it range like so. And what it does is simply gets a start and end and creates a new array from the length, which is again going to be the end minus the start. And we are going to fill in the array with the start range plus the index of each of the elements until the length of the array we set. Okay, so back in our dropdown, let's go ahead and delete this. And we can simply say now that we want a for loop, right? For a range we are going to create. So this is going to create again an array with the elements 0 to 23 inside. And we simply want to, for now, render a paragraph with the value itself. So let's check it out. Perfect. And as you can see, the dropdown gets cut right here because we set the max height to be 96 and then just simply make it scrollable. Okay, perfect. So let's now do the same for the minutes. Just go ahead and copy and paste this. Change the value from 23 to 69. Copy this and paste below for the seconds, like so. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we now have all of our values scrollable inside the dropdown component. Okay, so now before we get into each of the values and the logic behind them, we can already create on the bottom, right over here, a button. So again, it's just a simple button with a orange background. It has the text CSS. We are going to give it a full width, so the button is of the same width of the dropdown, and there's nothing much, so we make it a fixed height, a rounded, and just some hover effects with a transition on the colors. So as you can see, we have our button here, and we can already pass in the onClick event, which simply call the props on confirm we get from the parent component. Now, I don't know about you, but these scroll bars are a little bit ugly, and I want this to be more with the same theme of the dropdown. So in order to change that, what we can do is on the Timepicker folder is create a new file and call it styles.module.css. And inside create 3 classes like so. And this is simply the classes to change the scroll bar track, and the thumb. And for the scroll bar, we are simply setting a fixed height and width. We are going to remove the background of the track and change the thumb to something with a rounded border radius and the white background with a little bit of opacity. Now, in order to inject this, let's go on to our dropdown. And at the top, first of all, let's import the style like so. And now if we scroll on to the wrapper, we can see that we said we wanted this class to be conditional, but as of now, we only have the main class. And this is because we are now going to add a string literal with the styles.dropdown. Why dropdown? Because if we go on to the styles, we can see that this is the class we created. So this is the class we want to pass in on each of the wrappers. So let's go ahead and copy this, paste it over here, and do the same for the third wrapper, like so. Okay, perfect. And as you can see, we now have a much better scroll bar on each of the wrappers that kind of mimics the theme of our Timepicker. Now for the values, they are not going to be a simple paragraph. They are actually going to have some logic behind. So what we can do is create a new file, call it Timepicker Dropdown item, like so. Let's go ahead and create the function. And for now, simply return a div, return. And the interface is going to be as follows. So it's going to get the actual value that we want to print on the item. it's going to get a Boolean to know if the item is the current selected one, an on-click event that's going to be triggered every time the user clicks on one of the items, and finally, an on-selected event handler, which will be triggered every time the item is selected, and it will return a value to the parent component, and this value simply represents the position of the item in regards to the wrapper. This is so that in the future, and we will do this, we can scroll the wrapper of the items to the position of the selected item. So now inside the div, first of all, we can already pass in the props.value, okay, like so. And so that we can already see the changes, let's go back onto our dropdown and let's already import our new component right over here. So Timepicker Dropdown item, like so. We are going to need to pass in the props. So first of all, the value, which is going to be simply the value we get from the for loop. The is selected, let's first of all leave it empty. And we can do the same for the on click. So it's going to be empty. And the on selected also going to be empty. Sorry, the is selected needs a value. So let's just give it false for now. Okay, perfect. And the first thing we want to do on the item is, first of all, we want it to be as the same format as we have on the input. So let's go ahead and change this props.value to the pad number to string function and pass in the value. Okay, perfect. Now for the classes, it's going to be dynamic again. So Tailwind merge. The main class is, first of all, let's center the text. It's going to be extra small and it's going to be white. Let's make the width full and a cursor pointer so that the user knows that it can click on the item. Now it's going to be rounded, medium sized. It's going to flex and center everything. So justify center also, like so. Let's just give it a little bit of a Y padding, like so. The font is going to be semi-bold, and we want to have a over effect, changing the background to a white with a very low opacity of 10. So if we now hover on the item, we can see that the background gets changed. Now the only thing missing for the classes is if is selected, we want to change the background to another color. Let's say it's going to be orange, and so that the hover effect doesn't take effect from the main class, we also want to change it to the same color as the backgrounds. Okay, finally, if we click on the item, so on click, simply call in the props on click from the parent. Okay, perfect. So now going back into our dropdown, we can already change the is selected, and it's going to be from the props, time values, hours, like so. And if this value of the hours is equal to the value we get from the for loop, then we can say that it is selected. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we have the 0 with the orange background. Now for the on click, the only thing we want to do is call in from the props the set time values, because we are going to change the values. Let's get the old values first, and then return a object, which is going to be, first of all of the old values. And we are simply going to change the hours to the clicked value, like so. So now if we click on one of the values, like for example 3, we can see that it changes the background because this is now the currently value stored in the time values signal, and it reflects the changes on the input wrapper. To actually store the values outside of our component, we simply need to press select. So now it is stored. If we open again, we can see that it stays on the third value. One thing I don't like about this approach is that if we scroll down and let's select, for example, let's say 12, like so, save it. If we now open again, we can see that, first of all, the scroll bar is on the same position as the value. But if we scroll up, like so, it disappears, right? And if we close, open, we can see that the scroll bar is not on the same position of the selected element. And while there is the visual feedback here for the user, we probably should make also the scroll area on the same position as it is the selected value. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and go to our dropdown item again. and let's create a reference for the item. So again, it's going to be an HTML div element. And now let's create an effect and say that if we do have the item ref and the props is selected, so every time the item is selected, let's set a timeout. And I'll explain to you in a bit why we are doing this with the timeout. And inside what we are going to do is, first of all, get the height of the item. And we can do this by getting the client rectangle from the reference of the element, and then just simply get the height. And to pass in the position of the element itself in regards to the wrapper, what we can do is pass in on the onSelected, the offset top of the item. So this will give us the value of the offset of the item itself minus the height times 2. So we can get the actual top position of the item. Now, we did this with the set timeout of a very low value, just because that we have the animation of opening and closing the wrapper. And this height can actually change the value, and the offset top also will change depending on if the wrapper is open or closed. So we simply want to get the values of the height and the offset once the wrapper is open. So that's why we give it a little bit of time. We just wait for the wrapper to open, and then we extract the values so we get the correct values and not the wrong ones. So now back in our dropdown, let's go ahead and on the top, create 3 signals like so, and they are simply going to be of type number, and they represent the current scroll of each of the values of the hours, minutes, and seconds. And if we now scroll down onto the onSelected from the dropdown item, we know that we are going to get the scroll value from it. It's going to be a number. And the only thing we want to do is, if the dropdown is open, then simply change the signal of the scroll value to the scroll value we get from our item, which again, don't forget, it's the actual position of the top of the item in regards to the wrapper. Now, to change the scroll value of each of the wrappers, let's go on to the top and create a reference for each of the wrappers. Don't forget to pass in the reference. So here on the wrapper ref, pass in our wrapper hours ref. Now, what we simply want to do is create an effect like so, and say that if the dropdown is open and if there is a reference for each of the wrappers, then simply change the scroll top to the current scroll value of each of the wrappers. Okay, so one thing I forgot is on the dropdown item, we actually created the item ref, but we are not passing in the reference. So let's go ahead and do that like so. And now if we try to open the dropdown and select another value, let's say, for example, 12, you can see that as soon as we select it, then this create effect function takes effect, and it gets the offset position in regards to the wrapper, which passes in onto the parent prop right over here. It updates the signal of the scroll value, and then on the create effect, we are simply going to change the scroll top to the value of the item that was selected. If we now change it and open again, we can see that independently of where we have our scroll bar, so let's scroll it to the top, close, open. As you can see, it's always going to scroll onto the selected item. Okay, perfect. So now just simply do the same for the minutes, like so, and the seconds right over here. And don't forget to simply change all of the values accordingly. So in this case, it's going to update the seconds. It's going to check if the seconds is equal to the value, and it's going to update the seconds scroll to signal. Okay, perfect. And now you have your own time picker. We can actually change the values from the inputs, like I said earlier. So for example, we can switch between the inputs with the tab, and we can select it from the dropdown and simply click on select, like so. And as you can see, this is with a simple interface, and every time the value gets changed, the time signal is going to get updated. One way to check these values is to create an effect, and inside simply do a console log of the time, like so. If we now open the console, we can see that we have the time in seconds on to 0. If we now change it, let's say 1931 and something else like so, selected, and there you go. We have all of the seconds of the current value of the time. If you want to check the time in a hour, minute, seconds format, you can actually go ahead and import the seconds to time values from the component itself and simply pass in the time signal. So now, as you can see, we have the time in object format. Let's go ahead and change it. And there you go. We now have in seconds and we have in the object format. Okay, perfect. And that's it. You now have your own time picker, which you can use on your forms, on whatever project you're working on. And it has a super friendly user interface with only a signal for the time, which you can then convert to object if you prefer. I hope you guys liked it, and if you want to download the code for the component, you can always do it on my website. Until the next one, cheers!